before we get into Activity 64, I just want to finish up that concluding thought of Activity 63. Talking about the Ninth Amendment, the point I was making was that as far as Madison and the founders understood the Ninth Amendment, it was another amendment that kept the federal government within its limits and out of areas that were reserved to the states, such as personal liberties, by saying, okay, we've put some limits here, this is not a complete list of limits, there are other limits. And what I think is worth noting about Justice Goldberg's understanding of the Ninth Amendment is he makes it mean the exact opposite of that, that it's what he uses to justify the federal government getting into all these areas of personal liberties, that word liberty can include all those things in the area of personal liberties like birth control pills, etc. So it's what he's using to get the federal government into those areas. Now, in Activity 64, what I want to think about is we all know that a lot of social changes, or most of us know that a lot of social changes took place in the mid to late 60s and 70s and the years following. In particular, I want to focus on the so-called sexual revolution, that before that, traditional morality, the understanding was that it's right to keep sex within marriage. And then starting in the mid-60s, early 70s, it became the common idea that it was okay to have sex outside of marriage. And that led to a bunch of changes. I guess this is not to say that nobody had sex outside of marriage before the 1960s, but in addition to being frowned upon by society, the understanding was, well, if you do it, then, and the woman gets pregnant, you need to get married. That was part of the understanding. So what I want to think about here is, I think that was a complex change. There were many things that contributed to that change in our society. And in this activity, I want to think about to what extent the Supreme Court rulings had something to do with it. This is not to say that people are not responsible for their own actions. People are responsible we are responsible for our own actions, but sometimes governments can do things that create incentives or take away things that might stand in the way of our making decisions that might be self-destructive or destructive to others. I guess I want to focus, for starters, on maybe we'll start with letter B in Activity 64, and this is focusing on a connection that the authors of this article are seeing and of other studies have seen between out-of-wedlock births and other forms of social economic distress. We've already studied poverty as a probable outcome more than 50% of the time of out-of-wedlock births. But there are other negative consequences that studies have documented, such as increases in crime, drug abuse, etc. And so there are these negative consequences, and that's why these authors of this particular article that I've studied say that this is actually relevant to political policy, because these choices that people are making are leading to some negative outcomes for society. This is why I'm emphasizing in letter A the huge rise in out-of-wedlock births since 1965, the date of some of these rulings, such as Griswold versus Connecticut. So you get, in the period of the article, black out-of-wedlock birth rate in 1965 was 24%, and more than doubled to 64% in 1989, and then by the time you get to 2004, it's up to 69%. And just again, think about if this leads to increases in poverty and crime and drug abuse, where children in many cases are going to be without a father figure, etc. So to what extent in the African American community is the phenomenon of poverty and crime and drug abuse coming out of the out-of-wedlock births. You also see an increase among whites and Latinos, etc. in 2004. And overall, I think in the United States now 40% of all births are out of wedlock. Now, I just want to step back and think for a moment. As far as where traditional morality came from, let's just kind of leave that aside. Whether it's, let's just assume the most natural explanation is that people just kind of observed what happens when people make certain choices, when women have babies and there's no husband around to support. They saw a lot of poverty. People observed that when people were sexually promiscuous, there was a lot of sexually transmitted diseases, and maybe what traditional morality is just kind of saying, well, you don't really want to go down that route because it leads to lots of negative consequences for yourself, and we don't want you to go down that route either because it's going to cause us trouble too if you have children out of wedlock, etc. So that may be what traditional morality is, to try to prevent the kind of crime and drug abuse and poverty that we see happening when people have children out of wedlock. To what extent the rulings in Griswold, Eisenstadt, and Roe are responsible, that's something to think about. One thing that these rulings did was taking away a negative consequence of the behavior. If before birth control pills and abortions and stuff, people could just have out of wedlock, if they had sex outside of marriage, there would be these negative consequences to watch out for. Maybe people are more cautious about these behaviors, but if you can use birth control pills, if you can get an abortion when you get pregnant with an unwanted pregnancy, you can get an abortion or just not experience an unwanted pregnancy, then there's nothing to prevent people going down that path, and maybe that path has other bad results that are not being prevented. Just something to think about, and just letter D is about abortions and how the number of abortions in the United States, I think this is just common sense, have increased a great deal since abortion became legalized.